Hello, everyone, and welcome to the RELO Andes webinar. I'm Rachel Martin, and I am so glad that you are joining me. I'm watching the chat here, so if you are viewing live, please make sure you say hello in the comments. I would love to know where you're joining me from. This month, our topic is going to be about how to give some feedback when students make mistakes speaking in class. There's different strategies, and we're going to look at 6 of them. So let's go ahead and jump in. All right, like I said, I'm checking the chat here, and I'll just say hello to Luisa from Peru. Hello to Pamela. Oh, look at this. We've got a lot of people connecting right now. And of course, if you have found this video later and you're watching the recording, I am glad you're here as well. We make one of these webinars each month, so make sure you check back on the RELO Andes Facebook page to see what we're looking at next month too. Okay, so we are talking about responding to errors and correction strategies that work. Oh, look, we've got more people in the chat here. Hello to Jimmy and Kayal, to Miriam in Peru. I think I saw Bolivia go past really quick. Oh, another person here from Bolivia. It is so great to have you here. It is wonderful to be with a community of teachers, even just virtually, as we're all working on some of these same challenges and some different challenges. All right, so I want to ask you a question here. In addition to answering where you're viewing from, which is, oh, we've got Ecuador, we have Iquitos, we have Colombia, Peruvian living in California, fantastic. It is so great to have you here. So now I want to ask you a second question. When a student makes an error while speaking, what do you do? Especially now if you're teaching online or even before in a classroom, I want to start by just asking, how do you respond when that happens? Let's see here. So I know for me, it's always, well, I'll tell you my opinion in a moment because there's a couple different options you have. So I'm saying hello to Mila from Trujillo, to Pamela, who's from Chiclayo. We've got the opposite here, California living in Brazil. Oh, great. Okay, well, thank you so much for being here. As we're kind of considering my opening question, there's really 2 categories of answers. If a student makes an error while they're speaking, you can either ignore it or you can respond to it. And, you know, there are times to do both. Sometimes we understand the meaning, we just move on. Exactly what Martha is saying here. Martha evaluates when to correct. They're making that decision, kind of that split-second decision in the moment based on so many factors. Okay, let's see. We have some more people chiming in saying, I correct them accordingly. You know, it really depends on what the situation is, of course. Oh, we've got hello to Cusco, to viewers in Puno. Adil says they respond when a student makes an error. Karina is a little bit more direct here. Karina says, okay, but that's not the correct answer yet. Great, great. I like that there's some variety coming in here. And of course, this answer is not the same for me if I'm teaching beginners or advanced or depending on the assignment. But thank you for sharing some of your responses there. Today, like I've been saying, we're going to talk about 6 possible responses, and I think you've already covered maybe 3 of them I saw in the chat there. So the 6 categories, the 6 responses I want to talk about today, they come from a piece of research by Lister and Renata that was published all the way back in 1997. So their corrective feedback and learner uptake has been used by so many teachers and so many other researchers since then. I'm going to borrow their 6 categories. So we have recast, clarification request, explicit correction, metalinguistic explanation, elicitation, and repetition. Now that was a mouthful. Those were a lot of words, but we're going to break down examples of all of these. So let's take a look at a common scenario, okay? So a student says he became a teacher. Now think for a moment, if a student says he became a teacher, what's probably the quickest, most instantaneous, almost automatic way a lot of teachers will respond? Teacher will say, he became a teacher. So what you're doing during a recast here is you're just kind of restating what they said and you're correcting it. You are not telling the students it was wrong. You're just recasting it. You're reformulating it, giving them the right answer, mirroring it back to them. And this is by far the most common way that English teachers respond to student errors, at least oral student errors when they're speaking. So this is a recast, and let's do a couple more examples just to make sure we know what a recast is, okay? So if the student says, my sister, he likes fruit, the teacher might respond, your sister, she likes fruit. So as you see, the teacher is not telling them, oh, that's wrong, or there was a mistake there. But in the flow of the conversation, the teacher is restating it with the correction there. That's the recast. All right, so I'm going to give you an example here without the teacher reaction. So if you see this on your screen, if you are watching live, I want to encourage you to put your answer into the chat. How could you respond to this using the recast strategy? So if a student says, tomorrow I goes to the market, how can a teacher respond to that where you give them the correct answer, but you're not identifying, you're not saying, goes is the wrong verb. How do you do that? All right, and as I'm looking here, I'm looking to see some answers coming in. Of course, if you are watching this later, this might even be a webinar where if you have a piece of paper and pen, you could write down some of your own answers or your own examples as we go, or just keep them in your head. Your choice on how you want to participate today. So a sample response for the teacher using the recast strategy. Tomorrow, you are going to go to the market. So again, just restating it there, but with the correction. Okay, so that is recast. Edison. Hi, Edison. Good to see you. Oh, Edison put one in there. You're going to the market. Great recast. Tomorrow. I'm going to the market as well. Let's see. Martha has one there. I am going to the market as well. Exactly. You're keeping it conversational. You are giving the correction back. And I like Heidi's here. Heidi is expanding beyond the recast. And Heidi is doing what I would probably do, to be honest. You're going to the market? Cool. What are you going to buy? Because a lot of times, it's true, I tend to emphasize the fluency, and I really want my students to just keep talking. So it depends on the situation. And as we move on in this webinar, near the end especially, I'm going to talk about some of those considerations. When do you correct? When don't you correct? What's the benefit? What's the goal? But for right now, practicing the recast strategy, I think we've got the hang of it. Like I said, this is one of the most common ones that teachers use. It's also considered an implicit strategy because, like I said, you don't say, there was a mistake here. You just give them the correction and let it roll with the conversation. So let's look at the next one here. The next strategy is called a clarification request. And this is another implicit strategy, but you'll notice this one's a bit different. So I'm going to use the same 3 examples for all of the strategies. So you can kind of get an idea how if the student makes this error, you could respond to it in different ways. So if you want to use the clarification request strategy, you're going to ask questions to help the student realize that there was an error. You're trying to bring their attention to it, but you're not really giving them what they need to do. So in this case, if the student says, he became a teacher, the teacher might answer, oh, what? Did this happen in the past? And I'm really trying, if I'm using the strategy, I want them to have that aha moment. Oh yeah, okay. Past tense becomed, that doesn't sound right. And then they can make the correction on their own. Here's another example. So my sister, he likes fruit. Teacher can respond, who likes fruit? Is this your sister a girl or your brother a boy? So again, you're trying to help them recognize where that mismatch was in the sentence. Okay, you know what I'm going to do next? I'm putting that third scenario, the tomorrow I goes to the market. I've put it up here on the screen. And if you want to reply in the comments, I would really like to see how you could respond using this strategy. And there are so many different strategies that you can use, but using the clarification request, where you are asking questions to the students to get them to notice what went wrong. As I'm looking here at the chat, I see that, who was this? It was Maria said that she thinks this is a good way or a good correction strategy because it helps students to self-correct. So they start recognizing they fix that, they make those corrections on their own. Okay, let's see. So we have an answer here from Deanne. Deanne would say, oh, are you going to do this in the future? Louisa is a little bit just short and sweet, going, tomorrow? And that's starting to get closer to one of our other strategies too, but I think that works. It's asking a question to point them in the right direction. Let's see. Paula has when? Oh, tomorrow. So you're going to the market tomorrow. Great. Now that isn't quite a clarification request because you gave them the answer. So make sure if you're using this strategy, you're just bringing their attention to it. There's other strategies, exactly what you just did there, we're going to do in a moment. So let me show you my example, although I think all of yours work. Oh, when are you going to the market? Did you say tomorrow? Okay, great. So we have covered the recast strategy and we've covered the clarification request strategy. Both of these are strategies where you don't really tell them there's a mistake. This is an implicit strategy. The other four that we're going to look at, according to this taxonomy, according to this model, they're considered the explicit strategies because they're a bit more direct. Now, I actually want to highlight this comment here by Juan about how important it is to encourage students and make sure that they can stay confident, that they don't feel bad about the corrections. And I wanted to highlight that. That was a perfect comment because as we start talking about these next four strategies, they might even feel a little bit uncomfortable because these are the more direct strategies. So we're going to look at them for what they are. We're going to see how to use them. And then after we look at them, we are going to talk about when to use them, okay? I completely agree with Martha that you have to give them permission to make mistakes. It's so important in the classroom. All right, so our first strategy here in the column of explicit correction is called explicit correction itself. So in this strategy, you actually stop the student and you tell them what was wrong and provide the correct version. So if the student says, he became a teacher, the teacher could respond, you mean to say, if the student says becomed, so they're making the mistake with becomed, you actually point it out and you say, you meant to say you became a teacher. He became a teacher. All right, so let's look at this again. Another example. You're getting really used to these examples, I hope. So if the student says, my sister, he likes fruit, if you are using explicit correction, as the teacher, you can say, you mean my sister. She likes fruit. Again, you are pointing out the mistake, you're pointing it out, and you're giving them the correction. So I think you'll know how to do this one. If the student says, tomorrow I goes to the market, the explicit correction is going to look like this. It's going to be, you mean tomorrow I am going to the market. Now, like I said, sometimes this feels a little bit uncomfortable. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that we don't want to be using this all the time. Because if we're always saying, this is what you mean, you meant to say, students may not respond very well to that. They may start to shut down a bit. Maybe they could even be offended. Maybe in that one example, the student was not really talking about their sister. They were talking about their brother, but now I've presumed to tell them what they were thinking. So it's here. It can be very useful depending on the situation. If it's a small error, you want to make sure they don't fossilize it. It's one we want to have in our toolbox. We can say these are strategies in our toolbox. We have a whole mix of them, and you don't use a hammer for everything. You don't use a screwdriver for everything. You don't use a wrench or a saw. You choose the right tool for the moment. So let's move on to another one of the strategies that is in more of the explicit correction realm. This is called metalinguistic explanation, or sometimes you call it metalinguistic clues. So here's where you are giving the students enough information that they can kind of figure out what's wrong. You're giving them information about the language. And some students respond really well to this, especially, if they've memorized some of the grammar rules, but maybe they aren't quite putting them into practice yet. This is something where students can self-correct, and you're guiding them to it. So without giving them the correction, you're saying something like, so how do we put become in the past tense? He, and I let the student fill it in. For our next example, if the student is saying, my sister, he likes fruit, the teacher could respond, who likes the fruit? Which pronoun do we use when we're talking about women? Something like that. So the student is set up to self-correct, but unlike the clarification request, now you're giving them a little bit of a clue, a little bit of information that is language-based, that's about the language, so they can find that self-correction. Okay, so if the student says, tomorrow I goes to the market, I would really like to see your answers in the chat here. What could you say to them to direct them for how to self-correct? Give me an answer here that is related to the linguistic side of things, to the language. What language structure do we want to point them to here so that they know, goes, that's the one I need to fix. And while I'm waiting for some of your answers to come in, I am also looking here at the chat. And I want to highlight these two comments right back to back. Karina says they feel like they're taking an exam and they can get uncomfortable. And I want to acknowledge that can be very true about some of these explicit strategies, which is why we don't want to rely on just one of them all the time. However, let's also take a look at this comment here by Heidi, where Heidi's talking about fossilization can be real, and we don't want our students to make the same errors over and over and get in the habit of them. So there's a tension between these two comments, and I think it's very real, which is why we're learning, or we're practicing, we're reviewing today several different strategies. So you can vary your approach depending on how your students are responding to it. Do they want more correction? Are they at a level, or do they have specific goals where they need very focused, deliberate correction? It really depends. So I saw a great answer here from, I think it was from Matilde. Yes. So Matilde was saying, is tomorrow a word for the future? So great. And I think I'd have to add a second part to that. Is tomorrow a word for the future? The student says, oh, yes. I said, okay, so is goes how we say that in the future? Something like that. I would have to bring them in, or maybe they would connect that right away. I like that as a question. We see here. So Martha's talking about how these corrections don't have to happen immediately. And we are going to talk about that a little bit more. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, thank you for all of these comments. I'd like to highlight the comment from Diane, who said her metalinguistic clue, the way she might respond to a student is, if you're going to do it tomorrow, it's in the future. So how do you use go in the future? That's pretty direct, but I know a lot of students who would really appreciate that because they want to be accurate. And I think we understand this here. Louisa says, tomorrow. You are going to do this activity in the future. Yeah, thank you, Edison, for pointing out metalanguage is the language to describe the language. Whew, we're saying language a lot in that sentence, but you have a great point there. A lot of times, most of the time, we want our students to be using English, not learning about English, not talking about English, but actually talking in English. But we can use meta language, we can use some of this correction and description to help them make sense of it. It does have its place. So I'm going to move on to, well, there was my example, but I think you guys already covered it. So my metalinguistic clue, the strategy, if I'm using the strategy here, I could say, I heard you say tomorrow. How can you talk about your future plans? And hopefully, if that's something we've already studied in class, maybe they've practiced, maybe they've had some input, they've heard a lot of examples of it, it's gonna trigger that memory, that light bulb is going to go off, as we say, and they'll make the self-correction. All right, so elicitation. This is another one of the more explicit strategies, but what you do with elicitation is you use a pause really to just bring their attention to what they need to go back and correct. So you're not restating it for them, but you're kind of taking them back. You're hitting rewind so that they can go back and fix it themselves. So if the student says, he became a teacher, in elicitation, I would go, he, and I'm a very movement-based teacher. So of course, for me, it isn't just a tone of voice. It's also, expression or movement, but just kind of bringing them back to, here's the point. Let's go back and fix this one before we move on. Oh, Martha has a great point here about it's easier to correct students in the intermediate level. They feel okay, but with beginners, I have to be careful. So elicitation would only work if the student knows, actually has learned, can access the memory and the information about the correct form. If a student doesn't know that become is incorrect, I can say he become, like I can bring their attention to that all day. But if they haven't learned it, if they haven't acquired that grammar point, it's too early to make that correction. So I think that's a very good point about working with beginners versus intermediates. If my beginners are making mistakes, if they're making errors that they don't even know they're making, of course I can't stop them. I don't want to stop them to self-correct. I just want them to produce language. It's once they have a structure or something that I know they should be aware of, this is where using these techniques becomes more helpful, where I can bring their attention back to it. All right, so these are the same examples we've been going with here. If we have tomorrow, I goes to the market. If you're using elicitation, you can just go, tomorrow you. Exactly. All right, so we're coming to the home stretch here. We are almost done with looking at these strategies. And it it is a little misleading because there's only 2 that are implicit, and then there's 4 that are these more explicit ones that might make the students feel like they're being graded. I'm not suggesting you spend twice as much time on the explicit corrections. Most of the time, you probably want to use the implicit ones, or maybe you don't even need to correct that mistake in that moment. But just so that we have all of them here, repetition is where you use your tone of voice. You restate exactly what the student has said, but you use your tone of voice to highlight the word that's incorrect. So if the student said he becomed a teacher, the teacher can respond, he becomed a teacher? I know we all do this one. I think we all have like that eyebrow look. Again, it's another way to bring them back and have them make that correction on their own. My sister, he likes fruit. My sister, he likes fruit. It's all about bringing the student back so they can make that self-correction. Let's look at these one more time in a quick review. So the first 2 correction strategies that I shared with you are the 2 that are implicit, that are the least direct. So we have recast, where the teacher does not identify the error, but kind of gives you the correct version of what you meant to say in the conversation. Then we have the clarification request, where by asking questions, the teacher allows the student to realize that they made an error, that they need to correct something. We contrasted that with, on the other hand, on the opposite side, we have explicit correction where the teacher specifically says, here's the error and here's what you meant to say. We had metalinguistic explanations or metalinguistic clues. I actually like clues a little bit better because that's where you're reminding them of a language feature and the student can self-correct. Elicitation, which is using a pause to bring their attention back to what needs to be fixed. Or repetition, where you're restating it and you're using tone of voice, maybe facial expressions to, again, bring the student back to what needs to be corrected. So all the way through, people have been in the comments here, and it is lovely to see everyone is a little bit worried that if we use too many of these, students are going to shut down. In fact, we might even ask which strategy is best to use. Should we be sticking only with the implicit ones? How do you find the balance here? Well, it depends on so many factors, and you know what they are. We need to consider in any moment, in any activity, is the goal fluency or accuracy? Of course, you can put the 2 together. They aren't always opposed. But in deciding whether you correct something, which one is your goal in that moment? That might depend on the level of the student, the type of class, and your interaction with them, if you know what their goals are. Like Matilda is saying here, it always depends on our students, exactly. Someone mentioned earlier, and I think we highlighted it, someone mentioned that you don't need to give these corrections right away. So that's another thing to consider. Do you give immediate or do you give delayed feedback? Well, some of these strategies really only work in the course of a conversation. When we review something later, I can't just pause and wait for the student to correct it. So some of these don't work later on. However, it can be worthwhile. I always like to teach with, a piece of paper handy where I write down things that I hear, mistakes that get made more than once, or something that I know the students probably should have known. Maybe I've detected a misunderstanding. Maybe I didn't explain something well. I try to make a list of those as I am listening to students speak. And then we review a lot of those at the end. So we use that, I use that as a teachable moment after the moment. And I think that's a way to keep the pressure off of individual students as well, so they don't feel like they're being shut down or corrected right in the moment. There is also the factor of, can you give this correction individually or publicly. And I always prefer to give this sort of correction individually, but sometimes that isn't realistic. So I know that this can be a bit more challenging online. And I do recommend using the chat feature sometimes, especially if you're going to give more explicit corrections. And your students should know they're coming. If they're giving some sort of a presentation, sometimes I'll tell them, so when you guys present today, I'm going to be listening for that S at the end of your third person verbs. We've been practicing this. This is the grammar point I'm listening for. So if I hear anyone miss that, I'm going to let you know about it so that you can correct. Something like that. I give them a preview, and then I don't hit them with every correction. I keep it targeted. Other factors to consider. What is really interesting to me is that when researchers go and interview teachers, teachers usually say, oh yes, I will use a wide variety of strategies. It's really important to vary our approach. But then when they go and they watch classes, teachers almost always, in some cases exclusively, only use the recast strategy. And there might be many reasons for that, but it's worth knowing that and maybe thinking, how can you intentionally build one or another of these strategies in there? Can you start using elicitation or the clarification request? Maybe when it is appropriate, a metalinguistic cue, something to help students realize and make that correction on their own. Because sometimes the recasts, the students don't even notice them. You have restated what they said, but it's such a normal part of the conversation, it doesn't actually flag for them that there was an error involved. So that doesn't necessarily help them avoid that error in the future. Another thing that's really interesting when you look at the research on this, and like I said, this model was written back in 1997, so people have been working with these 6 for a long time. Students consistently ask to be given more corrective feedback than teachers believe they want. So it's kind of strange because teachers, we really do worry a lot, and we should worry about our students' affective state, their emotional state. We want to make sure that the affective barrier isn't high. We want them to participate, and that really becomes teachers' priorities. But then sometimes when you ask students, and I would say most of the time based on the research, when you ask students say they are more open to correction than we realize. Of course, it's really important to keep in mind the idea of saving face. We never want to embarrass students. And I think that's why students shut down if they receive correction. They stop participating because they either feel like they can't succeed, there's no way they'll ever figure this out, and they give up. Or unfortunately, they get corrected and then they're really embarrassed and they don't want to put themselves in that position of being embarrassed again. However, how important that is really depends on the age of the students, the culture, your rapport, your relationship, and the personalities of the students, of course. So with everything, there are so many factors to consider, but that's part of the art of teaching. We get all of this knowledge, we try and build our toolkit, and then in the moment, you have to make these decisions on how to apply it. I do think it's really important to remember, this is an old saying, so I put it in the format of what we would call a motivational poster, kind of a cheesy poster. It isn't what you say, it is how you say it. Sometimes the delivery matters, making sure that your students know that you are on their side and that you believe they can succeed. Oh, so Matilde's jumping in here with a great question. Is it more important how or when we correct? I think both are really important considerations. It depends on the moment. I mean, I think like what Edison is saying right now, it depends on how well you know your students, for one. It depends on what the activity is. Is it one where I should be interrupting or not? It depends. It really does. I have this on my slide, and I'm really sad that I couldn't find the original pictures. I used to teach, when I was teaching 11-year-olds, we actually had these up in our classroom, and we did them as big, giant, cheesy neon posters, that 11-year-olds would really enjoy, that said, "Did you get it right? Good. Keep going. Did you get it wrong? Good. Keep going." And those posters were up in the classroom because I really wanted my students to be comfortable making mistakes. Not that I want them to make mistakes because they're sloppy or they're not trying, but I want them to make mistakes and embrace the fact that you're going to get things wrong when you're learning a language, and that's how you learn. And sometimes those corrections, those explicit corrections that kind of felt iffy to us, sometimes you can help students not see those as threatening, especially like the metalinguistic ones. I get a lot of students who want to know, wait, why was that wrong? Can you explain that rule to me? Things like that. So it does, matter about the environment of the classroom matters. And really, we do have to think about how important is corrective feedback. We spent all this time talking about different strategies, different ways to do it. Well, how important you think it is depends really on how strongly you think your students are acquiring the language versus learning it. And we're not going to go into a whole debate about that, but I included this slide to remind us all, to remind myself too, that more input, examples can be just as important as corrections, because we want to not just think about the corrections, but we want to think about the uptake. And uptake is the term for when students take those corrections, they apply them, and they no longer make the error. So our goal isn't to just, to give them that feedback. It is really to see if they make that error again in the future. And one way to help them get over that, to get past them, is, of course, to give lots and lots of examples, level appropriate examples, of course, but input of the language the way it should be heard or spoken. All right, so that's going to bring me just about to the end of the webinar here. So you have been watching most likely through the RELO Andes Facebook page. I want to invite you to subscribe. If you don't already like the page, please make sure you are following. As I said before, we put on this webinar about once a month. So I'll be back in March talking about portfolios. I know that's a pretty relevant topic, especially maybe if you teach secondary, if you're headed into the school year. That is a conversation I want to have. And there is so much more posted on RELO Andes besides these webinars. There's lots of opportunities, so make sure you are subscribed there. And if you are free tomorrow I would like to invite you to come to a discussion group. Hey, there you go. Someone is reading my head. They already put it in the questions. Yes, we are going to have a discussion group tomorrow on Friday. It's at the same time as the webinar, so that's 2:00 Lima time. And we can probably clear off my slides here, and we'll just open it up to questions right now. But if you have more questions, or if you want to chat about this some more, I would really like to talk with you in the discussion group. About a half hour after the webinar, we're going to be posting that on the RELO Andes Facebook page. It's on Zoom. Just sign up and I will send you the link tomorrow. So I'm looking here in the chat if we have any questions. It has been great to spend this time with you. And I think we're going to wrap it up. So take care, everyone, and I will see you hopefully at the next webinar and at tomorrow's discussion group. Bye, everyone.